Good afternoon. There's so much going on in our world and many reasons to share space at this time. We're really glad that you joined us for our fourth webinar in the Reimagining Education 7-part series, which is hosted by LPI Center for School and System Redesign. Those of you who might be tuning in later, we're pleased that you're watching, and we encourage you to continue to be connected to the center's work. The Center for School and System Redesign is funded in large part by Stewart Foundation, and this learning series was conceived and designed with input from our co-sponsors, the UCLA Center for Community Schooling and the Gardner Center for Youth and Their Communities. As you may know, these sessions are organized around a recent report called High School Redesign, 10 Features for Success. This is a report that was authored by Linda Darling Hammond, Matt Alexander, and Laura Hernandez, and they outline practices and structures that lead to deep learning and personalization with students at the center. 10 Features for Success is the framework for our learning series, and it's also the cornerstone of our center's work. Our goal is to make it a living, breathing report, both in the digital space by sharing dozens of case studies, guides, video tools in our resource bank, but also by bringing you researchers to frame each of the features, and in these sessions, bringing teachers, organizers, educational leaders, and others to provide examples and strategies. Over the arc of our series, we've been exploring how to develop meaningful relationships, culturally sustaining pedagogy, and authentic curriculum and assessment, as well as approaches to center students, families, and teachers in the decision-making process. The Center for School and System Redesign builds on decades of research and connects the implementation of the science of learning and development towards schools transformation. CSSR will be a national hub that convenes, coordinates, and curates, bringing research, policy, and other resources to the field. In a moment after these remarks, we'll have a research presentation, and then we'll move to a moderated panel of our experts for a discussion. Following our Q&A, we'll invite you to join a breakout room with our presenters and members of the LPI team. The session today focuses on designing curricula for deeper learning and authentic assessment. We will hear about strategies for developing engaging learning experiences that are relevant to students and that have application beyond school. We have posted our video recordings of our sessions 1 through 3. We led off our series with 10 features, and then at that time we were joined by school principals who had redesigned traditional schools into smaller learning communities that led to really great outcomes for students. And in our second webinar, we focused on positive developmental relationship in designing safe and inclusive school. Last month, we talked about culturally relevant pedagogy and practices with teachers and an educational leader who had launched and supported pilot schools in Boston and Los Angeles. And we hope that you'll join us for our upcoming sessions in March, April, and May. The May session concludes our series. At this time, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Charlie Thompson, who is a research and policy associate working on whole child education, performance-based assessment, and educator preparation and support. She's credentialed in New York and California and has taught in both public and private schools in those states. A key research interest of Charlie's is how to design learning environments that cultivate student belonging, curiosity, and growth through meaningful feedback. She holds a BA in English and Lit and creative writing from Penn, and also a master's in urban education and policy from Brown University. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you, Cheryl. What a wonderful bio you shared. Extensive. I think it's exactly what's on the website. So I wanted to actually start, Mandy, if we could move to the next slide, that'd be great. So I wanted to start off the research presentation with an anchoring activity before we jump into the research. This anchoring activity is meant to do two things: anchor you to the work that we're doing today, and also anchor you to your fellow breakout room participants. You will have 1 to 2 other folks in your breakout rooms, and you're going to pick one of the following prompts and tell a story. You will either tell the story of a time that you really grappled with learning something, or the story of a time that you saw someone else share authentic evidence of their learning. Welcome back. Please drop some of the themes from your breakout conversations into the chat. In the main room, we were talking about the need for structural support to be vulnerable and to take the space and time to do the deep work really well. We were also talking about coming up against a bigger system and being able to make connections between the work that we were doing, where we wanted to go, and how it fit into the broader world that we were operating within. We also talked about the need for models and for exemplars and examples, because to do novel work, to do interesting work, it takes a lot of a lot of new things. I'm seeing from Sean the power of persistence and working through struggles, college and career readiness from Pam, reinventing secondary educations. Um, I'm going to move on, but I'd love to continue to see chats of what you discussed in your breakout rooms. Next slide. Some of the things that we discussed are aligned to what we know learners need. So there was a 2006 survey where respondents noted the following drivers led them to dropping out of school: a lack of connection to the school environment, a perception that school is boring, feeling unmotivated, facing academic challenges, and the weight of real world events. We've spoken at length about the ways in which you can support and foster connectedness to the school environment in other webinars on this series. I encourage you after this webinar to go back and look at those if you want to dig in more detail. But that is a key piece of the learning puzzle. We also know that meaningful inquiry can awaken the brain and be a powerful driver for learning. Providing appropriate levels of challenge and appropriate scaffolds, like the models we talked about in the breakout rooms, are essential to ensure that all students can engage with content. We also know that ignoring sociocultural contexts, linguistic diversity, and neurodivergent needs can harm students' abilities to see themselves as capable learners and lead them to disconnect from school. Content that is motivating and relevant to students' lives can support them in persisting through challenges, and providing opportunities to practice self-directed learning, independent learning, where students can move towards taking ownership of their learning, is also important, as is doing all of these things in a way that feels coherent both within the school building and with the wider world beyond. Especially in secondary schools, which is where I came from, students really need to understand how what they're learning matters to them, their futures, and their communities. And this sounds like a tall order, and it may seem easier said than done. Next slide, please. But if you're using authentic curricula, you can deliver on all of these needs. Authentic curriculum attends to those students' needs and provides learning through inquiry, project-based learning, and learning that is linked to students' experiences, interests in the real world. One way that this might look is by providing content expertise in combination with other essential competencies like critical thinking or collaboration or academic mindsets to support students in experiencing relevance and coherence in their academics. This can also look like engaging in inquiry school-wide, not just in a specific classroom, and engaging in sustained analytic projects where students learn through appropriately challenging tasks that connect to their interests and feel coherent with, and maybe, connected to other disciplinary content goals. Project-based learning, not just learning with a project at the end, learning through sustained deeper learning projects can support students in building depth of content knowledge. And there was actually a study of more than 2,000 students in 23 restructured schools where they found much higher levels of achievement on complex performance tasks for students who experienced what the researchers deemed an authentic pedagogy, which was instruction focused on active learning in real world contexts, calling for higher order thinking, consideration of alternatives, extended writing, and authentic audiences for students. There are also recent studies that have found that middle schoolers, including English learners, who participated in rigorous project-based learning and science outperformed their peers, and that high schoolers in advanced placement classes with project-based components did better on AP exams. So for these efforts to be effective, teachers must link the curriculum that is happening in the classroom to students' own lives and interests, their communities, and their future, their goals for the future. And by leveraging these, the students' experiences and passions, you can help make explicit connections to current events and get ahead of the question that at least I dreaded as a teacher, which is, why are we learning this? One other thing to keep in mind is that often less is more. Um, Doing this type of work likely means that schools and teaching teams will need to narrow the topics that they select so that they can go for depth of standards over breadth. That can be a hard conversation to have, but it is a really meaningful part of the process. Next slide, please. So we're going to see a video where students are engaging in this type of learning in a science classroom on the East Coast. I want you to look for those three things we just talked about that were on the slide: inquiry, learning through inquiry, project-based learning, and linking learning to to students' lives, their interests, their passions, and their communities. Hopefully folks saw some examples of inquiry-based and project-based and relevant linked learning to students' lives. If you want to drop any ahas or moments, I saw the chat going a little nuts in there. I agree, Anne. I also love Tyler and his enthusiasm for the chicks. Um, but if you want to, drop anything that you noticed in the chat, it would be great to see if other folks agree. Um, so authentic curriculum is wonderful, and authentic curriculum should pair with authentic assessment. Um, these two things do not exist in isolation from one another. They should exist in tandem. So authentic assessments are designed to surface students' facility with core modes of inquiry and exist along a continuum of complexity as are appropriate to the task and the disciplinary expectations. This might require, well, authentic assessments require students to show what they know by directly exhibiting a skill, reporting on an investigation, producing a product, or performing an activity. This can include oral presentations by students to a committee of teachers, peers, and the school community, who can test for in-depth understanding and assess the students' readiness for progress to the next stage of learning, including graduation, but it can also be much more low stakes endeavor. Um, Authentic assessment should include clear learning targets and goals that are demonstrated through rubrics or other expository documents that embody a set of standards against which students' products and performances are judged. This is not a black box. Students should know how they're being evaluated before they walk into an authentic assessment and be able to prepare for it. Educators also show students what they will need to do by providing models, demonstrations, and exhibitions of the kind of work that will be expected of them. There should also be opportunities for students to revise their work and improve upon it and receive feedback. Demonstrating their learning to meet the standards is not a one and done endeavor. This is a growth process. So in a system that has all of these features, students will have a variety of opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge and skills and to grow their ability to provide evidence of their learning over time. This is not something that you suddenly ask a 12th grade student to do a portfolio defense at the end of their schooling experience to qualify for graduation, and that's all that happens. It should be something that is growing and supporting their skill development over time. So over the course of a student's learning, they might produce research papers, scientific investigations and experiments, mathematical models, literary critiques and analyses, arts performances, and other disciplinary performances. And then those performances might include student-led conferences, and they might culminate in a portfolio defense or a capstone where students are doing a summative assessment of what they've learned, reflecting on their learning, and then making a plan to continue that growth. And the next slide, please. So the question is, can authentic assessment support learning? Yes, and so students who regularly engage in authentic performance assessments do as well on traditional standardized tests and better on tests of analytic and performance ability than other students, other similar students. And they can be better prepared for college. But the learning is actually not just for students in this space. Over time, educators deepen their knowledge of students' passions and interests and aspirations and can better design meaningful and relevant assessments that showcase what students know and can do. Teachers who regularly use and score performance-based assessments also learn about how their students understand the material and have developed their applied skills, as well as about the standards themselves that are embedded within the assessments. This happens in part by unpacking the scoring expectations, a process known as calibration. And when teachers unpack their learning targets and analyze student work using those learning targets, they can better refine their teaching and learning goals, practices, and activities to meet students where they are and move them towards ambitious learning goals that are also personalized. Next slide, please. So to do this work, there need to be proper supports for teachers in place. This means time to develop and refine expectations and processes if these assessments are designed at the school level, and time to adapt content to meet students' interests if you're using high quality instructional materials. Collaborative planning time enables teachers to do the deep work that it takes to not only plan for coherent and rich teaching, learning, and assessment, but also to norm around expectations for student work based on shared rubrics and expectations. Schools developing clear guidance on accommodations and scaffolds for students with exceptional needs is essential to ensure that all students can access challenging content and be prepared to be successful in these assessments. The last thing that I'm going to leave you with is that school schedules can become overrun with tests that are disconnected from learning, which means that there's less time spent on authentic, formative, and curriculum anchored assessments. This can also eat into time for authentic curricular activities. Schools, districts, and organizations and state education agencies that understand this predicament are working to rebalance the system so that teachers can prioritize authentic curriculum and assessments as part of a coherent learning experience for young people. Our panel is stacked with folks who are working towards this goal, so they'll tell you about the work on the ground. But before we hear from them, we'd like to ask you to reflect on your school, district, organization, state, wherever you're working, and think about the strengths that are present, as well as the areas you'd like to prioritize growing. So a poll just popped up. There are two questions. The first is, where do you feel your system is strongest in its authentic curriculum and assessment practices? This might include, these should be a multi-select, so you can click multiple options. There's learning through inquiry, project-based learning, relevance to students' lives and interests, specific disciplinary performances, interdisciplinary projects, culminating performance assessments, so the portfolios, defenses, capstones that we talked about, teacher learning and calibration, and the connection between curriculum and assessment. The second question is asking about where you see opportunities to grow next. And it has all the same responses as the first question, with the addition of using high quality instructional materials with performance assessments. So that's the HQIM acronym. And then the last one, I just wanted someone to be able to say, we just need to start doing this, because I've definitely been there before, and I wanted to give you a space to share your feelings. So I'm gonna leave it up for a little bit longer. We're just over 50% of our attendees have responded. So you'll have I think another minute to reflect on your system and think about where your strengths are and where you'd like to grow. And think about how those will apply as you're hearing what our panelists have to tell you about how they developed their systems. Wow, we're getting to, I think we're at 75, over 75%. We might get 100% participation on this poll. I think we'll give it 10 more seconds. I think Reese is in charge. So All right, we should share the results. I'm seeing that we've got a lot of strengths in project-based learning and relevance to students' lives and interests. A little bit less, but still specific disciplinary performances, culminating performance assessments, and the connection, relevance between students' lives and interests. I see that there's a lot of folks who would like to grow in that same area of relevance to students' lives and interests, and making the connection between curriculum and assessment. You're going to hear some really great examples in this next panel. And teacher learning calibration is another priority among our folks. So hopefully you have a clear vision for what you'd like to listen for in the next panel, and I'm going to introduce them. So all right, there we go. So our moderator is Anisha Badranarian. She is a principal consultant at Education First and a former LPIer, Forever in Our Hearts. We've got Jael Rebo, who is a 10th grade English language arts teacher and 10th grade level lead at Social Justice Humanitas Academy in Los Angeles. Mr. Solomon, the Vice President of Pathways Implementation at the Linked Learning Alliance. Roberto Vega, who is Assistant Principal at Social Justice Humanitas Academy in Los Angeles. And Devin Bodichka, who is the CEO of the Learner Centered Collaborative. Anisha, I'm going to kick it off to you.
Thanks so much, Charlie. And thank you so much for hosting this great panel. I'm so excited to be chatting with my colleagues today about authentic curriculum and assessment and how we can sort of bring this amazing vision to life in our schools and districts and in our systems. As I was watching and listening to Charlie talk today about what authentic curriculum and assessment experiences look like, I'm a science human, and it was just so wonderful to see that video of the science classroom where student inquiry was really, really driving what was going on. I saw a lot of commentary about that in the chat. And here's an experience that I have had frequently, and I'm going to ask my my fellow panelists for your thoughts here. Something that I see happen often is that we see examples like that. We see these really, really great examples of what meaningful, authentic, relevant teaching, learning, and assessment can look like. And someone is inspired by that. They think, oh my gosh, this is what I want to see in my school. This is what I want to have happen. They quickly identify that their current assessment system is part of the problem. It's a barrier to really meaningful, authentic engagement. And they say, okay, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to create an assessment system that is authentic and grounded, and it's going to have these like downstream effects throughout the system where it's going to change the incentives, it's going to change what we hold students accountable for, and this is going to be the change that we see. And what often happens is that they're trying to shoehorn that kind of an authentic assessment system into a teaching and learning environment that is not set up to actually support that. And so I would love to ask each of you, what needs to be in place to ensure that authentic assessments are actually working as intended and are part of a shift towards meaningful teaching, learning, and assessment experiences. And I'm going to start with Jael and Roberto to sort of start with the school-based experience and then ask others to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I think in our experience, the creating that space and time within the school day, really taking a look at what does your PD time look like if you have, 2 hours a week, what does that look like? What structures can you create? Is your school organized by departments, by grade levels? How can you use that time? How can you use that space? If you do create, for us, it's interdisciplinary projects, but if you do create an interdisciplinary project, what support and resources do you have available? Do you have advisory time? Can you use that? Class time? Are you able to move kids to the multipurpose room to be able to do an activity, or to the small gym? Do you have access to those? Do you have admin support for that? You know what I mean? Like, I know in the 10th grade, they do a museum project, but to do that, the kid go see a museum so they could observe the object label so they know what to write when they create their, it's not just about using art to create the exhibit, but it's also, you need to be able to write the object label. You need to write a vision statement for your each classroom. I'll go ahead and let Jael chime in here.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything that Vega said. And time is not just time within PD and all of that, which that's definitely part of it, but like time is in like multiple years. Like it's a process of trial and error and making mistakes and learning from them and then refining. And the best projects that we've created on the 10th grade teams are ones that we've worked on for 5, 6, 7 years. And at this point, we're just tweaking little things here and there, but it didn't happen perfectly the first time. There were some that were frankly very dull and ineffective the first time, but we had to try something, reflect on it, and then come back and look at it again. So another thing that helps is stability. I've had a core of two other teachers, the art teacher and the history teacher, that I've been working with for a really long time. And that's helped give us the stability to actually produce something that's authentic. And then other people, as they come in, have been able to bring in their own new ideas to help improve on what we've done.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing those ideas. I'm hearing a lot, like there are a lot of structures, right, that are in place at the classroom level, the school level, that are allowing people the time, the space, the examples to be able to do this work. Devin and Esther, I'm thinking about your experiences in actually helping systems come to be like this. And so I'm wondering if you can help us think about what it looks like to take those types of enabling conditions as a goal and to help transition a system from where they are now toward a system that allows authentic assessment, authentic curriculum. What kinds of supports need to be in place to allow people to engage in those shifts? And how do we sort of like monitor that over time? And Esther, you are unmuted right now for me, so I'm going to start with you.
All right, excellent. So I just have a caveat. I have been an educator for 40 years, and I was also a principal of a pilot school. And so I would basically draw on that as a means of seconding what Roberto and Jael said about all those enabling conditions. And I think it takes time and trust. I think now as I go into districts and I work with different districts to further their work with linked learning, project work-based learning, work-based learning, it takes time. They have to be willing to fail at it and launch the opportunity to revise it and reflect on it. And that's oftentimes districts feel like there's with the superintendents leaving after very few years, there's a push to make things happen as quickly as possible, and that doesn't always happen. So I think it's to be gentle and kind and to continue moving forward in that kind of work and space. But yeah, and professional development time is really important, that opportunity, but making sure that the teachers really understand the work well. So I'd say those are the attributes that you need to really develop.
Devin, what would you add to that?
Well, I love all of these comments, and even just the question I think is extremely provocative. We've had this system that when it comes to assessment has really been driven by this outside-in model, and we really believe that it needs to switch and be an inside-out kind of approach, starting with the learner and thinking about what kinds of feedback and assessment is going to be most helpful for the learner, and then building the systems and structures around that. And so, and it's very complex. There's lots of layers to this, as you mentioned, and it might be helpful to take a look just at a visual that we have, which is our learner-centered ecosystem model. So we've had the privilege to work with dozens of school districts and several state departments. And what we find is that it's really, really important to start with clarity about what are those outcomes you're trying to achieve in a particular community, a particular context. Those are the whole learner outcomes that drive it. And then there's a lot of hard work to align your learning model with those outcomes. School design elements, the things that Roberto and Jael were talking about in terms of time and collaborative structures. There's a lot that goes into it at the school level, and schools are, of course, part of broader systems. And so there are a host of enabling conditions, including things like coherence and resource flows and policies that all have an effect. And then kind of permeating through all of this is culture. What are our mindsets? What's the level of relational trust? What is our sense of collective efficacy? So it's a really complex process, and there's a lot that goes into it. But what we found is it's really helpful to work with communities to figure out how are you documenting and telling the story around these whole learner outcomes, because we see all these great practices in these pockets, but often teachers or school leaders or even superintendents are kind of reluctant to share what's happening. And so we've worked with many systems to create these scorecards, which really are a way for, at the local level, a way to aggregate some of these data points. And that helps to identify what the priorities are. It, is an important part of the improvement process. It also creates the space for innovation, for new models of assessment to actually be valued and shared in a public way, and sharing in a very transparent way that generates trust. And so this is an example of what one of these scorecards might look like. And again, they need to be co-developed in community. So they look and feel slightly different in each context. The schools in Hawaii are different than the schools in Kentucky, and they're different than the ones in Southern California. Their communities are different. But this is just an example of the kinds of outcomes that you might see. And I saw a question in the chat about, is it all one type of outcome or another one? And what we see in most cases is it's a blend where they're choosing some kind of traditional conventional metrics that are more known and familiar, but then they're augmenting and they're adding with things like portfolio defenses or other types of assessments that are really, really meaningful. And then they put them in an equal plane through this scorecard process. We often use this tiers of data model, which values the fact that sometimes when you're starting something new, just counting the activity is a meaningful outcome that you can measure. So if you're trying to do portfolios and you've never done them before, don't start with a rigorous analytic around your impact. Start with, are you actually implementing the thing that you're trying to do? That's your activity metric. And then start elevating. And I love how Jael was talking about the value of stability and iteration and the evolution of the process. So you go from doing the thing to how are people experiencing it? What kind of feedback are we getting? How does that inform the evolution of this practice? And then you just get more and more sophisticated and nuanced in the level of or the tier of data that you're looking at. But this type of model honors the fact that it is a little bit of a developmental process, and sometimes you need to start at the foundations with just implementing the new thing. And so I think the last thing I have here is all about competency-based models, which is farther downstream, but there's a lot to this, and we're seeing lots of really inspiring examples all around the country of learners at every level who are really committed to elevating these whole learner outcomes in new and different ways, and having a systematic structure like a scorecard seems to really accelerate that process and help us to get to that level of thriving and belonging that we hope to see.
Thank you so much. That raised like so many interesting things. I think that we could reflect on a couple things that are standing out to me from this like initial conversation. And I'm curious to see if this resonates with you or if you would push on any of this. One is, I think just about every single person who responded to this question, somewhat implicitly, and Devin, maybe you explicitly said this, that changing these systems, like you can't really just change the one thing, right? And I think this is something that I see a lot in the state and district work that I do. Everyone needs a starting point, and that needs to be balanced with this idea that you have to really think about changing the system. And that can feel really overwhelming. Like I want to acknowledge that can feel overwhelming and hard, but you can't really just change the assessment and then like hope everything else comes along for the ride. And so that's one thing that is sort of standing out for me here. But Devin, another thing that you really pointed to was the importance of that community-based engagement to actually create sort of the case making along with the process for how you make the shifts possible. And I love that, like, I think you gave us a visual that connected some of the types of enabling conditions and information that Esther and Roberto and Jael were all sort of like naming in their specific examples. And so I'm hearing, there's a system transformation component to it. We need to sort of tackle each of those pieces. And there are graded ways we can enter that process. So you don't have to do everything all at once, but you do have sort of a coalition of people that are helping you move forward. And that feels really important. I'm seeing some nodding amongst the my other panelists, and Devin, I see a thumbs up from you. Roberto, Jael, Esther, does that resonate with you as sort of like what it might look like to go from perhaps a more traditional teaching, learning, and assessment system toward something that is more authentic in both curriculum and assessment?
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a part in Devin's presentation where in the innovation part about showing proof, you got to gather that data. You got to kind of prove that it worked. I think that for our school, when Jael and I were both teaching, and I was teaching history, he was doing ELA. I came in 2012-13 at SJHA, but we didn't really build steam. We took our lumps, like Jael said, we really picked up steam about 2016 through 2020, the pandemic really. And you started seeing when it was history, ELA, art, and our Spanish teacher to some degree come in. Our ELA scores on SBAC were jumping at about a 10% rate through those 4 years, where we were almost at proficient or advanced in SBAC. Like I said, if you're doing this work, it's going to show in these other assessments. But what I like in Devin's slide with innovation is you gotta hustle. You gotta hustle that data. You gotta say, hey, this kid normally doesn't do this, but when we do this authentic performance-based assessment, they show up. Yeah. I'm gonna go back and let Jael or Esther chime in.
I do think it takes time to go through that process and to reach a point. I look at some of the pathways that we support, and they've been doing this linked learning practice for a decade, and you can really see the difference as opposed to newbies. And it's like just giving them the space and time to start the work of learning how to collaborate. So often teachers are isolated in their rooms and don't really understand how to collaborate. So it's giving them training opportunities to understand best practices for that as well. Really happy that one of the districts we're working with is now going to experiment and allow 10 schools that are both linked learning and community schools based to not do standardized testings and to do authentic assessments and instead. So that's really exciting, but I'm hoping they choose the more robust pathways that have been doing this practice for a while. So because it does take time.
Yeah, one of the things that this is also making me think about is how do we measure success in these systems? Like Esther, to your point, we know that these things take time. Jael, you told us that earlier too, like time is really important here. And I think we need to be thinking about what does progress monitoring look like, certainly. But also what do the wins early on look like so that you can document that there is growth and progress happening. You may or may not see, like Roberto, I was thinking about how the SBAC score comment is something that feels very compelling to a lot of audiences. It takes some time to get to a point where you can see changes on like a standardized assessment score. And then we could have a whole different conversation about whether that is the measure we should be paying attention to yet. But like, we need to be thoughtful about those like intervening steps. And so Jael, I think you went off mute for a bit. So I just want to create space for you to jump in here. And Devin, I see you too. So we'll go Jael and then Devin.
Yeah, I think you have to think about being transformational while working in what are often transactional systems. So often you want to create like progress on something like SBAC scores because that's what districts are often looking at. But ultimately, it's about creating creative thinkers and critical thinkers and people that can make connections between the different things that they study. But often, students are more likely to be successful. For example, I'm an English teacher. I always want them to write an essay on in every unit. But for a lot of kids, that's like the doom sentence. But when they get to do something else, like for example, like a performance where they get on stage with their friends and create an act, which is something that I couldn't do on my own, but I can do in an interdisciplinary project-based setting, then they're able to show that intelligence in one way. And it's exponentially always when you're working with other teachers and other classes and you're doing it effectively, you see that then when it comes back to class and they need to write about that topic, they do a way better job than they did before. So you end up getting that progress on, say, test scores as a result of creating more authentic learning opportunities that reach a wider range of skills.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah, this whole conversation is just bringing me back to, there's no single metric that's going to tell the whole story of the complexity of human development. And, if you think about like healthcare as an analog, if the whole profession optimized around one variable, we would all be very unhealthy because it's a complex phenomenon and learning is equally complex. And so I think no matter what you do, you want to think about multiple inputs to help you understand the sort of unevenness of human development and how that's playing out in whatever you're trying to implement. And when I draw back on my time as a superintendent, we went through these deep change efforts, and we would often see these implementation dips where things actually got worse in the early stages. But because we were looking at multiple measures, some things went way up. And that led us to have the ability to step back, reflect, and say, wow, if we're seeing these big improvements on some metrics and other ones not so much, do we want to do the safe thing and retreat back to what we used to do? Or do we want to persist and really try to improve in a meaningful way? And anyway, we saw big improvements because we had the kind of fortification based on those multiple measures. And so, yeah, regardless of where you are and what you're doing, classroom teacher, school leader, district leader, state leader, I think it's really, really critical to have multiple measures to take a look at to give you a little more nuanced sense of what's actually happening.
One thing this is making me sort of like want to put a pin in, because I know this could be a whole separate conversation, is the importance of a robust, nuanced data strategy. And I use data maybe like a little bit intentionally here, because I think assessment strategy sometimes it comes to mean like what tests are you using and what kinds of numbers are you getting out of the system. And I'm really thinking about like how do we diversify the information, the metrics that we're using. And so I just gonna put a pin in that for a second and say like we should come back to that. I want to share this has been such a rich conversation so far, and I can already sort of like hear in the back of my head the pushback I would normally hear if we were in perhaps a different room. And so I want to say a couple of things to you all, and I would love for you to respond to these fairly common critiques that we hear of more authentic curriculum and assessment systems. One concern that I hear frequently is that when we make these kinds of shifts to the system, when we are making a lot of changes, when we might see, Devin, to your point, those implementation dips, it can actually negatively impact, in particular, those student groups who have traditionally been underserved by our systems. And so, making the shift towards more authentic curriculum and assessments can particularly negatively impact our students of color, our students in poverty, our multilingual learners, that we see this in assessment data and in assessment results, those types of things. I'm curious how, when you hear similar types of critiques, when people say that we're, we're not serving those students when we're making these shifts. What is your response to that? How do you help people understand what authentic curriculum and assessment is doing for our learners at the margins and why that is meaningful for them? Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Jump in. Sorry, I'm twitchy on this one. Yeah. So I think there's one of my mentors is Myron Rogers, who's a wonderful writer, and he has this quote, which is the process you use determines the future you get. And so I think with that critique, the question that comes to mind for me is like, well, what is the process that you're using here? And who's involved? Who's driving it? And what I've seen is that if those students that you're so concerned about in this critique are involved in co-designing and co-creating these models, it's very hard to say it's not in their interests to advance this sort of option. And like the opposite is if it's externally imposed, which is kind of historically what we have done in this country and in this education system, what we find is it actually doesn't serve the interests of the individuals in context and in community. And so I guess my pushback to that critique would be to ask the question about who's involved. What is the process that you're using? And there may be a reason to be concerned if the process is reinforcing this external approach. But if it is really learner-led, learner-driven in context and in community, then we all ought to be supporting that, I think.
One of the strong arguments that you could make is that a standardized test, it's here's the student, here's the paper, right? In project-based learning, in authentic assessments and authentic curriculum, students are working together, collaborating. Students are helping each other and learning from each other. And I just thought it was so delightful to watch EL students just, I think, soar ahead through the assistance and help of their colleagues, their classmates, as they help them to learn English, and vice versa. They would help them with other kinds of skills, whether it was drawing or working together on a project, an architectural piece, or just really exciting to see. Or math, just a student who's really good in math but doesn't speak English well. That sense of really helping each other and collaborating and working together on each other's strengths. And I think that is a big plus for this kind of work.
Yeah, I think project-based learning, if you're doing it authentically, it's going to involve a lot of different skills and often different roles. And if we think about most of the real spaces that we work in groups on, there's different roles and responsibilities, and different people with different skill sets fit into those. So I'll give one example. Mr. Vega mentioned the museum project earlier. When we do the museum project, the students choose one of the topics that we studied over the course of the year and turn our advisories into museum exhibits. That involves all sorts of different skills. There needs to be a vision statement, which is written by some of the strongest writers in each advisory. So those might be some kids with, really strong writing skills. But then you obviously need artists. You need curators who need to decide what goes where and how it's going to be set up to tell a story. And those are often, interestingly, sometimes there's students that really struggle in class. Sometimes they struggle to sit still. They always want to talk to people, stuff like that, which is perfect for communicating with, 20, 30 students in a class and coming up with a plan for how everything's laid out. We have docents that walk people through and explain it. So those are people who are really good communicators. They might be students that really love to talk in class and love to talk with all their friends and all the teachers and know everybody. And as far as like the multilingual aspect, we were like, well, museum exhibits usually have everything in multiple languages, so we need to do the same thing. So you're able to integrate in multilingual dimensions. You can have, we live in a primarily Spanish community, so you can have a Spanish docent as well. There's, once you're doing something authentic, there's so many different spaces for different personalities and backgrounds to come forth to create something collectively.
Yeah. Thanks. Go ahead, Roberta.
Los Angeles, our school is 92%, free and reduced lunch. It's like 60% of our students are reclassified fluent English speakers, or they're EL, or they're long-term English learners across the board. So when we used to hear that, especially early on when our school first started, when the design team was writing the plan, and they were getting laughed at. And it's, well, what do you want? LAUSD at that time was only graduating 66% of its students. They had about an 86% attendance rate. Is that what we need to go to? Are you asking us to accept the things we cannot change? You know what I mean? So a lot of times your mindset has to be, I want to change the things I can't accept, and doing authentic assessments and kind of going rogue and doing this. Man, find that admin. Find the admin. If your school is structured through departments, there's usually an assistant principal assigned to you. Find them, say, hey man, I'm thinking about doing this. Let me and a couple of teachers jump on this. Let me and an English teacher jump on this. Right. But at that time, our kids may all be low income. We're all in Pacoima, we're all this and that, Los Angeles. They are actually diverse learners. When you start looking at their learning modalities, or their multiple intelligences, but their learning modalities, authentic assessment really, our interdisciplinary projects really touch on those. You're not just going to sit with a pen and paper and write quietly. You may need to be kinesthetic. At times you're probably going to have to, knowing in 10th grade, they always had to write something after the project. So it's like the project was kind of like helping them. It's like an assessment for learning, right? Instead of just an assessment of learning. And so usually, yeah, we got a lot of pushback. But like I said, once you take your lumps at the beginning, but you consistently do it, you're going to start to see that. We had the #1 attendance for a long time in all of LAUSD. You know what I mean? We had some of the highest jumps in our SBACs within those areas where interdisciplinary projects, those domains, those subjects that we were touching on. And so I think that it'll follow, but you got to kind of just jump in and just kind of start doing it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think you've named all of you have named some like really important points for us to remember. But Roberto, I think you really just like underscored this for us, that a big part of authentic assessment is actually giving all learners an opportunity to make their thinking, what they know and can do visible. And it's really important, because sometimes we just don't even give students the opportunity to demonstrate what they know and can do, let alone actually give them like really rich and relevant and engaging opportunities to do so. So thank you. I want to transition to some questions that we've gotten from the audience about the amazing insights that you all have shared. One question we've received is, in areas with educators who are less reflective of the student populations that they serve, how can we ensure that the assessment is authentic? How do you build or scale this understanding and capacity without unintentionally running into stereotyping, generalizing, essentializing, all of these unintended consequences that we do sometimes see emerge in well-intended systems? What are some ideas you all have about this?
Well, I think it's a really good question. And I think, just when you look most communities face this challenge. Like in most communities, the teaching or educator population is not quite representative of the communities that they serve. And so this is a really important question. And to me, so much of it gets back into those principles of like real co-design, and the root of that is empathy and proximity and spending a lot of time listening. And I think that to Roberto's point, even if you think that a certain community is like homogeneous, is probably not. There's a lot of diversity within every setting. And so really taking the time to do that deep listening and empathy in a co-design process is really helpful. And there are some like really time-honored educational processes, the I do, we do, you do kind of gradual release of responsibility that when they're done with like a real partnership and real empathy, can be fantastic to provide some modeling, and also, eventually setting the stage for learners to drive their experience in profound ways that will transcend whatever we think they might be capable of. So that empathy, proximity, co-design, I think is really at the heart of it.
I think we haven't really talked about authentic audiences, and when students give the opportunity to present in front of an audience, it's not just teachers, hopefully, but really healthcare workers or whoever. But you can also bring in community people who might provide feedback on those projects if there are issues with them, or they're ones that don't exactly address culturally acceptable kinds of norms. So I think that that's another way that you can address that issue.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Roberto, Jael, do you have thoughts about this?
I think another one is get feedback from the students. Every time we do one of these, we always as a school, we've set aside a structure of every semester. Students have a platform in which they're able to give us feedback, and there's a few leaders that collect information from the student body as a whole, and then come and provide it to structure it and provide it to the teachers. But that's a good way, because students will usually, if you've created a good rapport with them and a good trust, they'll be straight up with what worked, what didn't work, what resonated with them and their friends, and what didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you kind of want to give them voice. And so I think if you focus on, like for us, enduring understandings and essential questions are big. And sometimes that's the in, especially like when your content doesn't align. What are the overarching learning objectives that we want the kids to get? If you need to just kind of say, okay, I know SBAC and woo woo woo, but SBAC standards are just skills based. It's speaking and listening, reading, writing, right? Vetting your sources, all that's happening. What is the data in your community, right? What are some statistics in the community that you're teaching that maybe you could bring in? What are the things that the kids are passionate about? Here where we're at, we've had 2 walkouts already last week. You know what I mean? Our kids are planning a spoken word, tomorrow. And so those are things that they're passionate about. How can you incorporate those things that the students are passionate about? It could be a survey, but like I said, a lot of times, like there's already data about your community. It could be access to healthcare. It could be, when we did home visits in the 10th grade team, we found out a lot of our kids were missing school because they had asthma. Asthma seems to be a big thing in Las Vegas. Look at all the traffic around us, and kids were having debilitating asthma attacks. Those are things that maybe you could bring in and get the kids to begin to understand, a lot more about their community. But really, we're kind of breaking things down and saying, where do we want to go as far as like our learning objective? What skills then can we begin to apply here? And then from there, you could say, okay, then what type of an authentic assessment can we do that might give kids a voice, right? So within this, but I am going to allow my EL kids to be able to express what they're going through. I'm going to allow my LGBTQ plus kids to express what they're going through, and even our little cholitos to be able to express what they're going through. So you want to be able to create probably an assessment that allows them to give them a voice and bring their perspective, into this.
I really appreciate that. I mean, you've all shared such passion about this, and if I'm going to sort of summarize what I've heard everybody say on this point, now it's ask the kids. Like if the teachers are not, I mean, and in any context, teachers may or may not be reflective of every single learner in the classroom. So let's ask our learners for feedback, for co-design, for input on how we want to both teach and assess. How do we do this together with them? And I think that's a really powerful note on which to end. So I want to thank everybody here so much for engaging in this really rich conversation. I would invite you all of the panelists, to drop in the chat, maybe if you have one piece of advice for folks that you want to take away, folks to take away, please drop that in the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Cheryl and Charlie to keep us moving.
Great. Thanks so much to all of you for our panelists and Anisha for moderating the conversation today. We hope you're leaving with something new, insights or strategies for engaging students in relevant and rigorous learning, and that perhaps we've expanded your ideas of how to assess what students know and what they're able to do. We invite you to join us for our next webinar, which is on March 13th. We're focused on centering students and families. And in this session, Karen Mapp will be presenting the research framing and joined by a panel of experts, including teachers and high school educators. The recording and resources for this seminar and the others will be added to the center webpage. We'd love for you to follow up with us, and links will also be shared in that communication. I want to express gratitude to Charlie for your thoughtful presentation, and to Esther Solomon, Devin Batika, and Jalali Rebo, and Roberta Vago.